So just a little guideline of what I'm going to be doing in this stream. Again, we're going to start with the really simple, really brief, all about me, just so you know who I am, why I'm even teaching this to you, since I am 15 years old and I look kind of young compared to some other people you may have seen doing some of these presentations. And then we're going to get into the actual content. We're going to be doing something on what was the Columbian Exchange, and then we're going into depth about where it occurred. So the three main regions, the Americas, Africa, and the Old World, which includes Europe and Asia. And we're going to talk about what was transferred through the Columbian Exchange and why it was even important, which is always something you want to know in history. When you study an event, you can memorize all these facts about it, but AP World is really all about applying your knowledge to things. So it's always really important, regardless of what you're studying, whether it be something so early and so basic as something like the agricultural revolution, compared to something like the Cultural Revolution of China, you want to know why it's important, regardless of how, when they were, who was involved with them. You always want to know why an event was super important. And that's something we'll go into depth later about. So here's a brief intro. Hi, my name is Charlie. I'm 15 years old. I'm a sophomore in high school. I go to school in New Jersey. I took AP World History as a freshman. My school, AP World, is a freshman-only course. It's a very large freshman course because we don't have honors world history. So I ended up having about like 35 people in my AP World class last year. So that was definitely an experience. And I scored 5 on the exam. And basically, scoring a 5 on the exam sounds like the hardest thing on the planet because it's a college level course, and that's a thing that people are really just, they're interested in the course, but they think that because AP World is a college level course, it's really terrible and you're not going to get a 5 on the exam. But if you can learn to understand the content, not exactly like memorize word per word, but have a general knowledge of a bunch of different events and being able to tie them together and find their similarities, then you can definitely get a really good score on this exam, whether for you that means a 3 or a 5. And that's why we're called fiveable. And yeah, it's a lot of 9th graders. And I get to visit this year's AP World History class a lot. And they have 2 separate classes this year. And each of them have around like 15, 16 people, which is kind of ridiculous. It was a really large class, but it was also a very large room. It was almost like a lecture hall kind of room. So what was the Columbian Exchange? So here's an image on the side that you can just look at. And this is basically just to reinforce what I'm going to go over later. But I just wanted you to see it now because it is really important. Trade is a major topic in this time, which is around 1450 to 1750. This is when not just Europeans, but in this chapter we'll be focusing on a lot of different continents, but people are starting to go around the world. There's new developments in naval technology, new types of ships. People are traveling around the world to different places through the ocean, or whether it be by the ocean or by land, and people are traveling all over the world to different continents that were completely unexplored previously, other continents that had inhabitants, but people didn't really know of their existence. So it's really interesting to see this, especially because this is when the world truly becomes a little bit more globalized, even though it's not really what we think of as a globalized society. It's a lot more globalized than it was previously. So the Columbian Exchange was essentially the transfer of organisms between the New Worlds and the Old Worlds. So New Worlds and Old Worlds may be 2 terms that you're going to see on the AP exam, or you might see in your textbook. Instead of repeating, Africa, Asia, North America, South America, they're just going to use New Worlds and Old Worlds. So Old World refers to the continents that we studied a lot more in world history. These are the continents that Europeans had contact with. not essentially, they has nothing to do by age or like the age of the continents and when they actually like geologically appeared, but old worlds just refers to if the Europeans had encountered them early in history, they're old. If they just discovered them, they're new. So when I say the old worlds, I'm referring to Europe, Africa, and Asia. And then when I'm saying the new world, I'm referring to North and South America or just the Americas. They're essentially the same thing. So the Columbian Exchange, as you can see on this map, there's a lot of arrows. It's people traveling between lots of different areas back and forth to new places that are undiscovered or inhabited, but people have no idea that they're inhabited. And they're just going across the ocean to interact with other people. And this interaction unintentionally leads to the spread of diseases, ideas, culture, population, and plants and animals. So we call this process, this kind of like spreading of something more widely around the world, we call it diffusion. So AP World, diffusion is a major, really important term that you'll see a lot, and it sounds kind of complicated because as a high schooler, as someone that's taken courses, not very many because I'm only a sophomore, but as someone that's taken lots of courses, you don't really hear the word diffusion a lot until like chemistry. So if anyone here is a sciencey person, diffusion is essentially when you have a bunch of molecules on one side that are all cramped together and they spread out more evenly. So that's essentially what it is for history too. It's the spreading of something, in this case, from Europe, something that's just centered in Europe, and spreading it throughout the world. So there's three major types of diffusion in AP World, and I'm going to talk about them by the things that you see the most, and then the different types of diffusion that you see the least. So the one that I definitely saw the most as a high schooler taking AP World was cultural diffusion. And this, you can use the Silk Roads, for example. This is a little bit earlier in history, but I can use this example because this is definitely something that I'm sure everyone who's watching this has covered already because it's so early in the new AP World History time frame with the new modern setup. So cultural diffusion is just you spreading different aspects of your culture, whether that be, religion or any traditions, throughout a continent. So we could talk about the sand roads of Africa. Let me bring that up. So as you probably know, and if you don't, that's okay, but we'll just go over it really briefly. Africa was very, at this time, they followed something called animism, which was the worship of plants, not the worship of plants and animals necessarily, but they thought that they had spirits in them. And they thought that we should respect nature and we should respect everything surrounding us in their environment because they do have souls just like us. So this is what Africa was originally like. And with what's the spread of Islam becoming a lot more prevalent in the Middle East, it started to spread downwards towards Africa. And these followers of Islam would go on the sand roads and they would convert, they would talk about different stories, and they would talk about Islam, and it would basically convert people along this area. So that is essentially cultural diffusion. You're spreading your religion from the Middle East a little more southwards into Africa, and you're spreading your ideas, and you're spreading things. And this can be either forcibly or non-forcibly. And next one is technological diffusion. This is one we'll also see a lot because there's a lot of ship transportation. We see a lot of transportation between ships because people are getting more technologically advanced. And we have things now like astrolabes and compasses, and we have a lot more resources to make larger ships. So technological diffusion is the spread, as I said, but like the spread of different technologies. And in this case, it's mostly navigational technologies because it's so early in history. Later in history, we'll see stuff like technological diffusion. We'll see less of like the navigational technology, and we'll see more of like stuff like phones and computers. But right now, technological diffusion refers to compasses. Compasses originated in China, and they spread further throughout to Europe, and they really aided in the discovery, not exactly the discovery, but them finding these places that were previously inhabited in the United States. And the astrolabe, which originated on the Arabian Peninsula, the astrolabe was another navigational tool, and that spread throughout, and it really helped people, find these places. Yeah, so I'm gonna go to our first continent, and our first continent, pretty much two continents, are the Americas. So when I say the Americas, I'm referring to North America and South America. Before I get into that, is diffusion like syncretism? And yes, diffusion is like syncretism. Syncretism usually refers to religion. Usually you refer syncretism to religion, but they are very similar ideologies. They're not exactly like interchangeable, but I can definitely see why you would believe like they're similar. But when we're talking about diffusion, we're usually talking about, in this case, cultural, technological, and biological diffusion. Whereas with syncretism, we're usually talking about, usually when I mentioned syncretism last year in school, we were talking about Buddhism or Hinduism and their relationship with Hindu aestheticism. We can go into that later because I feel like that will go a lot better with the old world. So I will definitely answer that question a little bit more in depth once I get to the old world. But for now, I want to, talk about the Americas. So before, I mentioned two different types of diffusion. And you're probably wondering, you said you were going to say three. And I'm going to hold off on that one because this one occurred in the Americas extensively. So when we get to that section, I'm going to go into it full depth. So don't worry. The Americas. So we're going to talk about the positive effects and the negative effects of the Columbian Exchange. So you probably can think of lots and lots and lots of negative effects for America. If you see these pictures already, you can pretty much assume, like, you can guess what the one on the very bottom is, and then there's just a random horse. So we're going to talk about the positive effects, of which there weren't very many, but they're definitely something to mention because they do affect the Americas, both North America and South America, both affect them extensively. So the positive effects of the Americas. Because the Spanish come over with lots of different animals, they come with some that are a lot more liked than others. The Spanish came with a lot of mice and rats, and that kind of spread a few diseases. But the Spanish also brought horses, and you're going to see reintroduction of horses, and you're wondering why reintroduction? Well, the Americas used to have horses very early in history, kind of around a little after Pangea, once animals actually started to, develop. And there were horses, but horses in this area weren't developing to the environment, and essentially they died out. They were kind of like the mammoths of the Americas. They kind of died out, and the horses never lived again in North or South America. But then they stayed in Europe and Asia. Europe and Asia had the perfect climate and the best living standards, the best surroundings for the horses to live in. So horses died out in North and South America. But when people came to the United States from Spain, they brought back horses. And horses were really beneficial. And now they could live again in this area. And when they brought horses here, they really helped Native Americans. So Native Americans at this time, not all of them, were hunter-gatherers. They weren't really, they didn't have settled agricultural lifestyles. A lot of them were pastoralists who moved with the seasons, or they followed their herd. So this was really important because horses gave them a way to travel along long distances, whether that be to get food or find new places to set up. Horses weren't used as food for people in the Americas. They were mainly used as travel for them to make their sedentary lifestyle, no, their non-sedentary lifestyles, sorry, their pastoralist lifestyles a lot easier. And the horses let them travel very long distances, and they helped them carry very heavy things so they can move to new areas for the season. So horses just really helped life for Amerindians, which is just short for American Indians, Indians in the Americas. It made their lives a lot easier. So some other positive effects, and you're going to see this for every single continent that I do. There are new crops. So the Americas had a certain foods, certain crops, certain just products in general that the Europeans had, but they hadn't been introduced to. So at this point in history, Native Americans, whether they be in Canada or all the way down to Brazil, they had never seen things like onions or citrus fruits or grains like wheat and rice, barley and oats. Some varieties of rice were native to places like Canada and North America, but the varieties that we think of off the top of our heads, stuff like white rice, jasmine, were not native to this area. So with Europeans and Asians as well, they had all these things and they introduced them to the Americas. So because of European, Asian, African interaction, we have onions, we have citrus fruits, and we have grains like wheat, rice, barley, and oats. Now we're going to go into the more negative effects. And I feel like these are the ones that we can think of a lot more off the top of our head. The Columbian Exchange, although there were a lot of positive effects, there were a lot more negative effects. And the Columbian Exchange had a drastic effect on the population of the United States and just had a very large biological influence on the United States. So Americans early in this time had no immune protection. They had never been exposed to diseases from Europe. They had never been seen or even heard of these diseases. They did have certain diseases in their areas, but they had immunity to them. So once the Europeans came with these diseases like smallpox and influenza, they were dying. And even though these weren't killing Europeans, they had just become so immune. Their immune system had gotten so used to the diseases in their body that they were just not affected by them. But the Native Americans had never had these diseases before, and they had never had to deal with this. So when they brought over stuff like smallpox and influenza, they died in mass numbers, and it caused a lot of issues. Those diseases were linked to domesticated animals not found or domesticated in the United States. Yeah, so animals were main reason for diseases. Rats came on ships a lot. Animals could sneak onto ships before they left, and rats carried these certain diseases that they could spread to people once they got here. But also humans did spread some other diseases as well. And our next disease that we're going to talk about is the spread of African diseases. So this is one that is, as Mr. Beckman said, like those diseases are linked to animals. Smallpox and influenza can come from both animals and humans, but Yaws, which is the disease we're going to be talking about currently is by touch. You get it by touching other humans. So this had to have been spread by African slaves who came to the Americas. So Yaws, I chose not to include any pictures of these diseases just in case anyone was just like gets the heebie-jeebies about diseases, but I included this image of people dying of smallpox. It's a drawing, so it's a little less graphic, but if you choose to look at the pictures, you can look at the pictures if you wish. So Yaws is this disease that was only spread by human touch, and this was a deadly, deadly killer, because whereas the other diseases, they could be spread through breath or bite, this one you could just get if you just accidentally touched a person. So Yaws is this tropical disease, this skin infection that you would get. And it caused blisters, like white blisters, and it killed a lot of people as well, especially areas where there were large African populations, like Brazil. Brazil had a major Yaws crisis during the time of the Columbian Exchange because of the interactions between Native Americans and Portuguese settlers there, as well as the slaves there. So here's a practice question. So just to reinforce what we talked about before with just biological diffusion. So basically what I was talking about with all these diseases, stuff like smallpox and influenza and Yaws, is the other type of diffusion that we really only see in this part of world history. I mean, we briefly go over it later with the Spanish flu epidemic, pandemic, which is in the early 1900s. But this biological diffusion, you pretty much only talk about it with the Columbian Exchange. And as I said before, diffusion's the spreading of something more widely. So biological diffusion is the spread of diseases more widely. They're spreading things like Yaws and influenza and smallpox from Europe, Asia, and Africa, and spreading them to the United States. So that's what we were talking about with the United States. Not just the United States, but United States, Canada, Central America, and South America. So here's your practice question. Which of the following consequences of the Columbian Exchange most affected Amerindians in the 16th century? So in case you don't know, I rarely hear the word Amerindians, but it just refers to native people in North and South America. And be sure to notice that it says most affected and it's bolded and underlined, just because all of these options affected Amerindians, but the question's asking you which of them affected the most. So A, diseases cause pandemics. B, newly introduced crops replace indigenous American crops. C, the influx of African slaves displaced Amerindians. D, European livestock disrupted Amerindian agriculture. So just take 2 minutes to answer this question, and then we're going to move on with the next continent. You don't have to explain your answer. You can, if you want, you could just leave a letter in the chat, which is on the right. Just drop a letter, think about it for a second, and then we will go over it. I will explain the correct answer, and then we're gonna go on to, I believe, Africa. So yeah, until 5:34, just 2 minutes. If you don't know the answer to the question, or if you do, you can just leave the letter. But if you're just confused about like how you would even go about this, or if you have like 2 answer choices that you know are definitely not it, and you have these 2 that you're caught between, you can definitely just tell me that and I'll go over it. So we have 1 response in the chat already. As long as we get maybe 2, we can go on. So just another minute or so, just if any student can answer, because I know that there's only 5 people, and two of them are teachers, I believe. So okay, so I'm going to start explaining the question itself. So we have 2 answers. Okay, they're both for letter A. So if you chose letter A, you're correct. We're just going to go over why it's letter A. Newly introduced crops replaced indigenous American crops. That's just completely false. I mean, it's not completely false. Like, there were some crops that had become a lot more popular and a lot more produced and grown than indigenous American crops, but this wouldn't affect Amerindians that much. They would still have food. They would still have a stable source of nutrition, so it wouldn't really affect them too much if this were the answer. Next, C, the influx of African slaves displaced Amerindians. And this is completely just not true. We look into Brazil. Brazil, Africans mainly lived on plantations. There were very few Africans who didn't live on plantations. And plantations tend to be in more wooded areas, areas with trees, areas that were not already inhabited on. So African slaves did not displace Amerindians. If anything, European settlers displaced them a little bit more than Amerindians. So this is also not a very plausible answer. And then D, European livestock disrupted Amerindian agriculture. And this is very true. There were sheep and horses that weren't accustomed to this area, and rats even, and there were the spread of diseases on food, and there were issues with agriculture, of course, but that does not have as large of an effect as diseases have on people. Diseases can kill people, and although lack of food can kill people, disruption doesn't exactly mean that it was completely affected. Disruption just means that it was made less convenient. Disruption doesn't mean that it completely went away. And yes, loose pigs can completely just stomp on what you're making or you're growing, and they can definitely just completely ruin anything that you're growing. So definitely a good point. Who came over in larger numbers, Americans, Africans, or European? I really could not, I don't have an exact statistical answer, but if I were to just use like my historical logic, I would say Africans. And as you're going to see when we go over Africans, Europeans had plantations. So these were places that they grew sugar, where they grew different types of crops, especially in the United States, tobacco is a big one. So these places required a lot of manual labor. So it would make the most sense that there were more Africans than Europeans, just so they could efficiently work and make the fields, make growing crops as efficient as possible. I'm gonna put another light on because it's not very sunny outside today. So yeah, I would assume that Africans came over in larger numbers just to help with the agricultural lifestyle of the Europeans once they moved to the Americas. It would just be, my assumption would be that there are more Africans. Another practice question. So a historian researching the effects of epidemic disease on the population levels of 17th century colonial Peru would probably find which of the following sources most useful. A, church records of baptisms and funerals. B, Accounts by Spanish doctors of cases of miraculous healings. C. Transcripts of court cases involving inheritances. D. Petitions from Amerindian groups to the colonial government requesting tax relief. So you can answer this question. Again, you don't need to actually write a full answer. You can just leave your letter. And again, if you don't know the answer, just be sure to indicate that in the chat on the side so I can go over it and I can explain how you can approach this kind of question if you got something like this on the AP exam or if you see something like this on your actual test. If it's dark, does it look dark in the room from where you guys are looking? Because at the angle I'm looking at this, the room just seems very dark at times and then seems very bright and then very dark. And it kind of just has to do with the way the sun is currently. Okay, it's fine. It looks very odd from my perspective from here, just me looking into the computer. It looks absolutely black at some points and then it's really bright. So I didn't know if it was an issue. Okay, it doesn't look odd. Okay, I was wondering because it's like a disco light, you put on, what's it called? Like a disco ball, and it's on and off and on and off, and it kind of looks crazy from this end. So yeah, while I'll wait for until 5:40 for any other people to put any answers in the chat. We already have one answer, which is also A. So we're gonna actually talk about which one of these answers is correct once we get about another answer to this question. Okay, Lucia is not sure, and we can definitely go over that because these are critical thinking questions. This question isn't exactly a historical knowledge kind of question. It's something that's just, you have to use your historical knowledge, your background on. This is not something that you would just know off the top of your head. It's not something that's factual, something that you have to memorize. Lucy is asking, are we also talking about native populations? And when we're talking about population levels in colonial Peru, we can just assume that this is most likely native populations. So Peru, if you can imagine South America right now, Peru is towards the Pacific Ocean, not exactly on the Pacific Ocean. I believe they do have a coastline, but they do have a coastline. They're on the Pacific Ocean. So people, South American nations on the Pacific Ocean tended to not get as many slaves as countries on the eastern portion of South America, just because Africa was a lot closer to a nation like Brazil than a nation like Chile. If you were going to go to Chile, you'd have to do a whole loop-de-loop underneath, and you would have to go. So I have a globe right here. I don't know how much it would help just because of the angle of the camera, and it's all gray. So this is Africa right here. So a lot more slaves from Africa came to Brazil just because of the closeness of it. But if we're going to Peru, you would have to go all the way underneath, almost touch Antarctica, which would be nearly impossible on these 17th century colonial boats. And then you would go all the way here to Peru. So in this question, yes, because of just where Peru is located and just some general geography knowledge, we can assume that population levels is referring to just not just Native Americans, but Native Americans and white settlers. Yeah, so Lucia brought up a really good point. Church records are not the most accurate way of information, but it is still the most appropriate answer out of all of these. So we'll talk about all these answers, but yes, it is A. So yes, church records don't seem like the most appropriate, most statistically accurate answer here. You see church records and you don't think of as reliable as something like hospital records, but that's just because in this time, now, everyone's born in a hospital. So you would think that they would have the most statistics on something like births and funerals. Churches, on the other hand, Christianity was well spread throughout Africa, South America, Central America, North America. Throughout this time, there's spread of Christianity has been spread mainly by Spanish settlers. So because most people at this time were Christian, as Eric Beckman explained in the chat, it's definitely most likely and it's most useful that you use church records. And yeah, Lucia is completely right. A is the only mention of something that's related to population. So B is of accounts by Spanish doctors of cases of miracle healings. But we can't assume that everybody who had a disease was miraculously cured, because most of them did die. So C, court cases involving inheritances. Well, inheritances doesn't mean that they died of epidemic disease. Inheritances just means that you are wealthy at this point in history. And inheritances is usually, it's just going to refer usually to Spanish settlers, because natives at this time are giving each other inheritances. So, and then D, petitions from Amerindian groups to the colonial government requesting tax relief. That has absolutely nothing to do with population whatsoever. So we can knock out that answer completely. I hope that I simplified this question well, because it was very in-depth. So Africa, again, another continent we don't really think has very many positive effects of the Columbian Exchange with, but we have new crops. Before this time, Africa did not have vanilla, cassava, or peanuts. So vanilla, although it may seem kind of vanilla, like quote unquote vanilla, it's really important. Not exactly now, but later in history, vanilla allows countries in Africa to have economies, to make money. So the nation of Madagascar, you might have heard, not just from like the penguins of Madagascar, but Madagascar vanilla. They're well known for their vanilla, and they get a lot of money. A lot of their support comes from vanilla sales. And Réunion, which is not a country, but it's an island that belongs to France technically, they also grow a lot of vanilla, and that's how they get a lot of their income. And then cassava and peanuts, two very important crops, and they basically save so many people from malnutrition because they're so filling. Cassava is filling. It does have vitamin content, and then peanuts have protein. They have a lot of oil in them. They have all these amazing things that, like, if you weren't having other crops at this time, you could essentially just live off of cassava and peanuts. And it saved a lot of people, especially during times of famine, which we'll go into depth. We'll go into depth with famine when we go over Europe. So this is just an image of cassava. You might also know cassava by two other names. Yucca is also cassava, I believe, and manioc. They're just different ways of referring to the same exact thing. And then negative effects on Africa. When we think of the Columbian Exchange in Africa, we just think of negative effects. We just think of slavery. So that's definitely one of the effects that we'll see here. So because Africans are getting exposed to the American diseases, as I said before, biological diffusion, this population is exponentially decreasing. People are dying of diseases, and it's just not great because people don't have this immunity. Cassava can be used to make fufu, and that's definitely, going back to what I said, the positive effects. Fufu is essentially just a paste that it became the staple of a lot of people's diets during this time because it was just so filling, and it had all these carbohydrates, and it still gave you energy. So the introduction of cassava from Central America to Africa definitely saved lots of people's lives. And it was definitely a very positive effect that helped a lot of people. Because a lot of people were leaving Africa, not voluntarily, but because they were being enslaved and brought to North and South America, because people are bringing them to these places, there's such an exponential population decrease. And there's no one to run empires. There's no one there to help with economies. And there's just no one there to help keep these empires going. And leads to the fall of Songhai or Songhai. Don't really know how you would pronounce it, but I remember going over it in AP World a lot. And it's this empire in Mali, modern day Mali, which is like Western Africa. And they essentially fell because slave people that were coming looking for slaves came to Western Africa because just its proximity to Europe. Yeah, I'm not really sure how you pronounce it. It's also spelled with a Y sometimes. Yeah, both spellings work. I don't really know how you pronounce it, but it's not it is an important empire, but it's not one of the more important ones that you probably studied when we studied Africa. Slavery, it seems like the most obvious effect. So Lycia is asking, the empire fell due to population decline. So yeah, as Mr. Beckman said, yeah, Songhai was in the middle of trade routes, and as people were traveling through the ocean, the trade routes became a lot less traveled on. But also with that would still let the empire live. There are less people, but if people wanted to travel throughout Africa, they would still come in these land routes. What really brought this empire completely down was that people from Western Africa were just leaving, and they had to go to places like Brazil and the United States, and they had to leave the continent, and there was no one left in these areas completely. Families were destroyed, and governments were destroyed. So yeah, the empire fell for a lot of reasons, but it's kind of like a domino effect. Like this led to this, which led to this, which led to this. So slavery is the other one. Slaves, when we think of slavery, may just be as, because most of us are Americans, but we think of the United States. We just think of Emancipation Proclamation, slavery, and slavery in the South versus the North. But in reality, most slaves taken from Africa went to Brazil. And this is because Brazil had a lot of sugar plantations, and Europeans just wanted them to work on the sugar plantations so they can make a lot of money. So most of these slaves, I would definitely say over 90% of the slaves, 90, went to Brazil. And this is just an image. It's a painting just showing a Portuguese man beating his slave. And this is a Brazilian piece. So the Old World. So the Old World is referring to the United States and also, not the United States, I'm sorry, Europe and Asia. So the Old World was pretty much positively affected by this. Like the Columbian Exchange gave them all these opportunities they had never had before. So there's these new crops. We have tobacco, which is the image on the right. You might not be able to understand that this looks like tobacco. Like when we imagine tobacco, we just think of like the dried up brown paper bag kind of looking stuff. But this is what tobacco looks like before it's dried. So tobacco, although it led to a lot of health issues later on, tobacco was sold throughout, and it definitely helped to boost the economies of Britain especially. So next are the potatoes. So potatoes are native to the Andes, which are located in South America. So when potatoes came to the United States, they were seen as this source of easy energy, carbohydrates. They were really filling, they were really cheap, and they were easy to grow. And potatoes sustained Ireland for centuries. Like when we think of Ireland to this day, we still think of potatoes. So yeah, potatoes definitely helped lots of people in the Old World just survive through hard winters, and where there wouldn't be any fresh vegetables, and they'd have to just eat potatoes. And we also have tomatoes because of the Old World. When we think of Italy, a lot of people just think of like pasta, and pasta has usually sometimes tomato-based sauces. So yeah, definitely something that we can't imagine. Even Italian food, we can't imagine Italian food without tomatoes. So Lucia asks, so bananas and peanuts are to Africa like potatoes are to Europe. Africa has a lot of sources of just carbs. Like I mentioned before, cassava Cassava is essentially like European potatoes. So yeah, all those crops are super important. They basically help sustain millions of people really efficiently. Um, because of the old world, because of um, Europe and Asia interacting with all these different people, and they also have so much more food than before because they're growing potatoes, they're growing a lot of new, more sustainable crops. So because they have all this food all of a sudden, there's a lot more food than there was before, the population is increasing by large numbers. So Europe and Asia have massive increases in population during this time. Going through these a little quicker, be sure to like ask any questions if you really want, if you need to, or if you're just confused about something, but I believe there are some practice questions. So this is another practice question about the potato, as I said before, an Incan crop. So the introduction of the Incan staple crop of potatoes outside South America led to A, a decrease in China's production of rice, B, the replacement of corn in the North American diet, C, an increase in Andean potato production as an export cash crop, and D, an increase in Northern Europe's population. I actually went over this question, like unintentionally kind of answered it in my little lecture. So until like 5:55, because I kind of mentioned this answer, and I shouldn't have mentioned the answer, but I did mention the answer. So yes, there should be a foo-foo emoji at this point. There are just so many emojis of the most random things on the whole planet. But at this point, we definitely need emojis for some other things, especially things that literally save millions of people. So for now, just answer the question really quickly. Okay, Lucia says D. I'm not even going to attempt to say this. I believe this is just like a hit at the keyboard kind of name. But if not, I am so sorry. Djibouti. D, we have a D or a D or C. D and C are definitely the most appropriate answers for the answer to this question. So C, an increase in Andean potato production as an export cash crop. There wasn't, what's it called? A lot of exporting of food during the Columbian Exchange. And yes, you're going to say, wait, didn't you just say that people got introduced to them from different continents? But once people had potatoes in Europe, they weren't going to go back to South America to get more potatoes. They would just start growing the potatoes in Europe, which leaves us with D, an increase in Northern Europe's population. So yeah, Ireland, not just Ireland, but mainly Ireland, they're eating a lot more potatoes, and their population just skyrockets from there. So the answer would have been D. So our next question, which of the following would best support the conclusion that the Columbian Exchange involved more profound consequences than did earlier biological exchanges in world history? A, previous exchanges did not involve societies at radically different levels of technological development. B, previous exchanges did not involve the world's two hemispheres. C, the Columbian Exchange involved the peaceful transfer of animals, plants, and diseases. D, the Columbian Exchange was accompanied by the spread of missionary religions. So I also briefly went over this when we were going over biological diffusion. And just going over all the continents in general, I kind of hinted at this question. But you can leave a letter in the chat and I will go over this. So when I'm doing AP World questions, my favorite thing to do is just to eliminate two answers, because I always feel like there's two answers that are very logical and then two answers that are absolutely just like fillers and they're not very even logical. So in this case, there are not exactly, this one isn't as like set in stone as to like which one is definitely the illogical one. But be sure to read over for things like adjectives, things like I may have just given a hint away, but there are some adjectives included in these answers that may just seem completely illogical and just do not lead you to the right answer. So if you can leave a letter in the comments of what you think the answer is, and then we'll briefly go over this, and then maybe just one more practice question for today's stream, and then it can just be an open question session. Okay, so as I'm looking at the poll, I'm going to look at the poll now. I haven't actually seen this since I posted it. No ninth graders, which is kind of surprising. I think it's just my school being weird, because what I've seen is that most schools, if you're going to take an AP your freshman year, it's usually going to be human geography, and then a lot of AP World History students as sophomores and juniors. Yeah, but oh, you teach mostly ninth graders. Okay, so it's not just my school, but yeah, as in ninth grade I took AP World, and then as a 10th grader I'm taking Honors US History 1, and then next year I'm going to take A Push. So that's just how my school did it. I had so many freshmen in that class. There were so many people in that class. So it is tough stuff as a freshman, especially because we had never studied world history before this. Before that, I pretty much only learned U.S. history and briefly went over stuff like the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Greeks and 6th grade history, but that isn't really as helpful anymore just because of the new changes with AP World. So yeah, it's definitely kind of tough. It may be easier depending on what school you go to, what you've learned, but yeah, regardless of what you learned before, it's definitely just tough information for a freshman. So we have one answer, and it's B. So B is the correct answer. I'm going to go over why B is the correct answer. A is just a completely false statement. There's societies that are less civilized. I don't want to say civilized because that just sounds very like kind of almost Eurocentric, but I'm going to say civilized. There are definitely societies that are less civilized that interact with more civilized people. In fact, this is the entire sand roads. The sand roads, the Silk Roads, were essentially just merchants selling to everyday people, every day selling to merchants. So yeah, C, this is the one I was hinting at. It says peaceful transfer, which is kind of ironic since like so many people died of diseases. And it's almost odd to say like it involved the peaceful transfer of diseases. It's almost kind of like oxymoronic, like they're contradicting each other. So not the correct answer. And then D, the Columbian Exchange was accompanied by the spread of missionary religions, mainly Christianity. That's a very true statement, but it's not as profound, as important as the fact that there's 2 different hemispheres and it's such a large area. So yeah, I'm not even going to attempt to keep saying this name. B was the correct answer. So for the person that did say B, good job. Okay, so there was a passage that I was going to include with this, but at this point it's getting kind of late and into the stream, and I'm wondering if you guys want to really read a 3-paragraph long passage. So here's the question, and you're going to answer it without the passage because I keep doing this unintentionally, but you kind of unintentionally answered this question in the chat earlier. So the impact of manioc, which is the same thing as cassava, as described in the passage, just completely ignore that part. So the impact of manioc was most similar to that of which of the following components of the Columbian Exchange? A, cacao, B, potatoes, C, sugarcane, and D, smallpox. It's kind of a straightforward question just because we mentioned this for when we talked about Africa and when we talked about Ireland. Yeah, B is the correct answer. Manioc and potatoes both were easy sources of carbohydrates, and they provided people with really just filling options. Cacao was what you used to make chocolate, and that was usually reserved for people that were rich, royalty. Cacao was not an everyday kind of thing, whereas cassava, manioc was like an everyday kind of staple. Sugarcane is not really the most appropriate answer. Like, sugarcane is not something you'll just eat straight up like manioc. And then smallpox is a disease, and manioc saved people from dying. So that's kind of also contradictory. So that is the end of all the information I have planned for today. If you have any questions, you can feel free to just leave them in the chat, because for now it's just going to be like a chill questions and answer kind of thing. It doesn't even need to do, oh, I'm super, thanks. Thank you so much. It doesn't even need to do about the Columbian Exchange. It can be about, I feel like every week I do this, I get someone who asks me, what book did you use to study for AP World? Like every single week. And if that's your question, that's absolutely fine. Because right now it can be about pretty much anything related to world history that you really want. So feel free to leave any questions in the chat until probably like an hour and 7 minutes. So once it is around like 6:06, 6:05, technically 6:06, I'll be answering questions, and if not, then I'm going to end the stream. So if you have any questions that are left in your mind, just answer them rapid fire, like right now, since we don't really have too much time left. Yeah, but honestly, I think that this stream went really well. I went over lots of information, but it's also a very, very, very important part of AP World. The Columbian Exchange, I don't want to go into too much depth about how it's going to affect people later, but the Columbian Exchange definitely has such a major effect on the development of places in Latin America later in history. When you go into the 1800s, 1900s, and you're talking about industrialization, and you have to go over the Irish potato famine. Like, before we were just talking about how important potatoes are, and then later in history, not 200 years later, but more than 200 years later, we see what happens when we take away the potatoes. And the potatoes, we don't have this steady source of food. We see a mass exodus of Irish people to the United States. We see a lot of death, which is similar to what we had before with like starvation and famines that we see nowadays even. So yeah, everything in AP World connects. And the Columbian Exchange is just one of those things that affects so many other things. It sounds kind of broad, but there's two events that I always say are like the two, there's a lot of important events, but these are like the two really important ones, because they just, you can not blame, but you can just say that everything in history was kind of caused because of it. And one of them is the Columbian Exchange, because it pretty much caused so much stuff later on in history that you'll see when you get to it in class. And the agricultural revolution. Like, the agricultural revolution is such like a beginning thing. Like, it happened so early, and it happened, it basically gave us food. And food basically, and history can relate to everything. It gave us agricultural revolution let us live in homes, and that led to empires, and empires led to war, and war led to rivalry, and everything just completely connects to each other in history. And I think that's why I like history so much. But yeah, there aren't any questions, so I'm going to end the broadcast. I hope to see you guys next time I do a stream, which hopefully will be next week. We'll have to see if I'll be doing a stream next week, but if not, I'll definitely be doing one in 2 weeks. So be sure to watch out for any streams I do, and please sign up for them. And then any other streams that are happening tonight or any other nights, be sure to watch our AP World History Dream Team. So for now, bye guys. I hope you learned so much, and I hope that I was definitely effective in my teaching, and that I could reinforce your AP